I realized something was wrong. The night the rig shook like a breathing creature beneath my feet, as if the metal itself was trying to warn me before it was too late. They told me there were 11 rules every structural officer had to follow out here, but they only shared the first few, leaving the rest for me to discover the hard way. I still remember the first time I broke one of those rules and felt the whole station react to it, almost like it recognized my mistake. What happened after that is the reason I'm finally telling this story, because something down there hasn't stopped watching me since. The first time I heard Rule 1, never ignore the first tremor. No matter how small it feels, I treated it like one of those safety phrases companies slap on walls to look responsible, something meant to scare rookies more than guide veterans. I'd been on rigs before. I'd felt metal complain under pressure, and I thought this one would be no different until I felt the faintest shiver run through the deck, subtle enough that I thought my own heartbeat caused it. Malik, the senior officer, looked at me with this strange mix of pity and warning, telling me quietly that if I'd really felt something, I should have logged it immediately instead of brushing it off. That night I kept replaying that moment in my head, wondering why his voice sounded so heavy, like he was remembering something he wished he could forget. I didn't understand the weight of that tremor until the following morning when we ran our routine walk, and I noticed small dust trails on the floor beneath the support beams, like the metal had shifted microscopically while everyone slept. Malik pointed at them without saying a word, as if expecting me to understand their meaning the same way he did, but all I felt was a growing unease that made my stomach tighten. The deeper sections of the rig always felt colder, but that day the chill had a strange pulse to it, almost matching the rhythm of those dust trails. When I asked if this sort of thing was normal, Malik simply said, "You'll hear it again soon, and next time it'll be louder." I didn't like how certain he sounded, as if he'd already accepted the next tremor as something inevitable. Later that afternoon, while inspecting the lower struts, I noticed something that made me stop halfway down the ladder. A single bolt on the main joint was slightly rotated, not enough to threaten the structure, but enough to indicate movement. The strange part was the direction, a slow twist outward, as if something beneath the rig had exerted pressure upward instead of the usual downward stress from the currents. I touched the bolt and felt warmth radiating from it, a soft, steady heat that didn't make sense in that depth where metal was usually cold enough to sting. Malik refused to touch it, shaking his head and telling me softly that warmth meant it had reacted, though he didn't explain what it had reacted to. I reported it to command like procedure required, but the operator only replied with a long pause before telling us to keep eyes on the area and continue normal operations. It wasn't the words that unsettled me, but the hesitation in her voice, like she was choosing not to tell us something. When I asked if the seismic monitors had picked anything up, she claimed nothing was out of the ordinary, and yet I could hear conversation behind her, quick urgent whispers that were abruptly cut off. Malik heard them too, because he stepped away from the mic with a tired sigh, muttering that they always say everything is fine, until it's not fine at all. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't just routine maintenance. That night the rig developed a hum, low and uneven, as though something beneath us was passing through layers of water thick enough to muffle its movement. It didn't sound mechanical or like pressure equalizing, and it lasted just long enough to make everyone stop what they were doing and listen. The vibration was subtle, a mild ripple more felt than heard, but it traveled through the metal beams in a way that made my teeth ache. When I looked around the control room, I saw the same expression on everyone's face. No one wanted to be the first to admit that they'd felt it. Malik finally broke the silence by telling everyone to get some rest, but he stayed behind with the monitors, watching the depth charts like he expected something else to hit. Sleep didn't come easily, because even after I left the control room, the memory of that low hum stayed in my bones as though the rig were still vibrating. I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment I first ignored the faint tremor and wishing I had treated it with more seriousness. There's something oppressive about the darkness down here, a kind of pressure that doesn't just surround you physically, but sits inside your chest, Every few minutes I thought I heard movement in the walls, soft shuffling motions that could have been shifting metal or could have been something far worse. By the time I finally closed my eyes, I regretted ever brushing off the first sign. Around dawn the rig shuddered again, not violently but deliberately, the way a sleeper shifts to find a more comfortable position. I swear it felt intentional, a carefully measured push that rippled through the support beams and up into the deck plates. When I rushed to meet Malik, I found him already staring at the structural readouts with a grim expression, telling me that the tremor wasn't natural and that it had traveled upward instead of sideways like a normal underwater shift. He didn't need to explain why this was concerning. The rig was built to withstand lateral stress, not vertical, and especially not from below. The worst part was that the sensors hadn't recorded anything, as if the movement wasn't geological at all. We went down to the lower level to inspect the beams manually, even though every instinct in my body told me not to. The deeper corridors felt wrong, the air strangely thick, like breathing inside a sealed engine room without ventilation. Near the mid-support frame, another bolt had rotated outward, this time more noticeably, and the metal around it had a faint discoloration, spiral-shaped, almost organic in pattern. Malik ran his glove across it and immediately pulled his hand back, staring at the residue on his fingertips as if it frightened him. He whispered that we shouldn't be down there and turned to leave, but before we could climb back up, another vibration rolled beneath us, slower and heavier, like a long exhale from something massive. I grabbed the railing instinctively, feeling it thrum under my hand like a living pulse, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. But the look Malik gave me told me he felt it too, and hearing him say softly, "That wasn't the current," sent a sharp coldness through my chest. The tremor faded just as quickly as it came, leaving the corridor uncomfortably silent, like the rig itself was holding its breath. Malik insisted we leave immediately, but as we climbed the ladder, I noticed a thin line of fresh dust falling from the beam above us, drifting downward in a slow swirling motion. It wasn't from our footsteps, it was falling straight down, as if the rig had just shifted on its own again. When we reached the control deck, the emergency lights flickered for half a second, not because of a power issue, but because the rig's internal stabilizers registered an unclassified movement. The system didn't recognize the motion pattern. It flagged it as unknown, an alert I had never seen before in any training module. The operators topside claimed they saw nothing unusual, but again, I heard hurried whispers behind them, the kind that made you think they were withholding more than they were admitting. Malik told me quietly that we were past the point of first signs now, and that ignoring them had put us directly in the path of whatever was moving underneath us. His words made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were inching closer. By midday, the team avoided the lower struts entirely, even though no official order was given. Conversations were shorter, eyes more strained, everyone waiting for another tremor. When the floor beneath me vibrated again, I felt the movement travel up my legs with a smooth rolling precision, almost like something brushing along the underside of the rig. I froze, pressing my hand to the nearest column, and felt a faint warmth radiating through it, the same heat I'd felt on the rotated bolt earlier. That warmth pulsed once, almost gently, then vanished, leaving the metal cold again. I didn't tell anyone about it, partly because I didn't want to sound paranoid, and partly because I wasn't sure if admitting it would make things worse. The day dragged on with that uneasy tension until evening, when a deep shudder ran through the entire platform, strong enough to rattle the tools on the workbench. Malik and I rushed to the observation bay, expecting damage or a pressure shift, but instead we saw something impossible. The sediment around the base of the rig was slowly swirling upward, like something beneath us had displaced it in a concentrated circle. The water didn't move naturally. It spiraled as though pulled by a force rising through it. Malik stared at the screens with wide eyes, whispering that this was only the beginning, that the first tremor had been a warning we failed to respect. Before I could ask what he meant, the feed glitched, then returned with a faint distortion at the edge of the frame, something dark and elongated brushing past the camera before slipping out of view. I leaned closer, thinking the distortion was a glitch, but the shape moved with intention, like a shadow turning. The last thing I remember before the feed cut again was the unmistakable impression that it wasn't moving around the rig, it was circling us. The second rule, Rule 2, never touch the metal when it starts breathing, sounded absurd the first time I heard it from Malik. But now, after the tremors of the previous night, I understood why. That night, I was inspecting the southern support beams alone, and the metal beneath my boots began to pulse softly, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that felt alive. I crouched beside a lower strut and rested my palm on it, curious, despite everything I'd been told, and immediately the steel shivered under my touch, warmer than it had any right to be. It expanded slowly, deliberately, like it was drawing attention to my presence, and I felt a cold tingle travel up my arm, as if the metal were probing for something deeper than just a hand. I pulled back, but the vibration lingered under my fingertips, rhythmic and heavy, almost mirroring my heartbeat. The corridors around me were empty, yet I could hear faint echoes moving through the walls, distorted, unnatural. I whispered aloud, "It's just metal, it's just the rig," but the sound didn't reassure me. Instead, it bounced back in a distorted imitation of my voice, soft and deliberate, a cruel mimicry that made my chest tighten. I tried to step away, but the warmth seemed to cling to my skin, crawling over my glove, sinking into my senses, and I realized that ignoring this, like I had ignored the first tremor, would not be possible this time. Ramos's voice came suddenly over the comms, low and urgent. "You touched it, didn't you?" I froze, my words stuck in my throat. I just felt it," I said, voice trembling. "Don't. Step away. Gloves. Now," he commanded. I hurriedly slipped on the thick insulated gloves he'd instructed everyone to keep near the lower decks. He explained that the metal, when it breathes, learns the touch of anyone who makes contact, memorizing patterns, heat, pulse, even the rhythm of fear. "Once it knows you," he said grimly, "it will call you back." The thought made my stomach drop. My pulse raced as the walls seemed to shift around me, faint pulses echoing the rhythm of my own blood. That night, the rig seemed alive in ways I couldn't have imagined. Every support beam I passed throbbed, faintly, almost imperceptibly, yet I could feel the energy radiating through the floor. The vibration wasn't random. It followed me, tracing each movement, creeping closer when I slowed, retreating when I accelerated. I kept my gloves on, touching nothing directly, but even the soles of my boots seemed to feel the faint exhalation of the steel beneath. I whispered to myself, "Rule 2, never touch the metal when it starts breathing," as if repeating it aloud could protect me. But deep down, I knew the rig didn't care about rules. It only remembered. The first full tremor came around 2:17, a low, rolling pulse that surged beneath the deck. It wasn't violent, but deliberate, like a heartbeat from below. I crouched near the hatch to monitor the pressure sensors, expecting mechanical feedback, but readings were normal. The steel beneath me expanded gently, exhaling warmth into my gloves, pulsating in perfect rhythm with my own heartbeat. I felt a creeping panic. My hands twitched involuntarily against the insulated gloves, and for a moment I feared the metal could somehow sense the anxiety running through me. The hum rose and fell like a living thing, and I realized that Rule 2 wasn't just about avoiding contact. It was about surviving the rig's attention. Ramos met me at the south maintenance hall, flashlight trembling in his grip. "You feel it, don't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He explained that the rig's breathing wasn't structural. It was something beneath, something ancient, using the steel as a conduit. It replicated my movements, my pulse, even my shallow breaths from the first night. The idea made my head spin. "If it touches you first," Ramos warned, "you won't just feel it, you'll answer to it." My skin prickled, every nerve on edge, as I imagined the steel somehow reaching into me through the vibration, mapping me. I wanted to run, but my legs were stiff with fear. As we moved through the lower corridors, The metal exhaled in waves, rolling along the beams, pulsing faster when I slowed down. I could see the bolts twitch, tiny shifts that shouldn't happen without human interference, almost like a heartbeat visible under the surface. I kept my gloves on, breathing carefully, reciting Rule 2 silently, like a mantra. The deeper we went, the warmer the steel became, radiating heat in a pattern that was deliberate, almost teasing. Every step felt like stepping on a living organism, not an inanimate rig. I tried to convince myself it was a mechanical anomaly, a natural response to deep-sea pressure, but instinct screamed otherwise. By midnight, the breathing had intensified. Vibrations traveled through the hull in waves, rising and falling like lungs expanding and contracting. I could hear echoes of my own voice in the metal, each word distorted, slower, heavier. I whispered, "It's not real, it's just metal." But the sound came back at me, with the weight of something aware, something patient. The rig was watching, learning, and I understood Ramos's warning fully. The gloves insulated my hands, but not my mind. Every fiber of my being felt observed, measured. I had broken the first tremor rule, and now the second loomed over me like a predator waiting in the walls. When I finally reached the observation deck, the tremors seemed to follow me, moving through the beams in sync with my steps. The crew below moved cautiously, eyes wide, silent, sensing the subtle vibrations as I did. The metal pulsed once beneath my gloved hand, then again, slower, deliberate, almost as if it were testing me, waiting for me to panic. I whispered again, "Rule 2, never touch the metal when it starts breathing," trying to anchor myself. But the rig wasn't anchored by rules, it was anchored by observation. I could feel the steel remembering me, memorizing my rhythm, and I shivered at the thought of what would happen if I broke it again. The final pulse of the night was different, deeper, more insistent, as if it knew I had understood it. I felt it rise through the deck into my bones. A slow exhalation that traveled the length of the platform. The steel expanded, warmed, and then contracted suddenly, sending a sharp shiver through my gloves. I stumbled, gripping the railing for stability. A shadow flickered across the lower corridor, fast and fluid, though there was no current. Ramos said nothing, just watched with his usual calm, resigned expression. The metal had breathed, I had touched it, and now it knew me in a way nothing alive should. I lay awake after my shift, still feeling the vibrations echoing through my body. Every beam, every bolt seemed to pulse faintly, in response to my heartbeat. I realized that Rule 2 was more than a guideline, it was a survival mandate. If I ever touched the metal again, even accidentally, I feared what might come through it. And somewhere below, in the black depths, whatever had lent the steel its breath was awake, patient, and waiting. My pulse matched the rhythm of the beams, as I whispered one last time into the empty quarters, "Never touch it, never touch it," and the faint exhalation that came back wasn't my own. The third rule, Rule 3, never look into the depths alone after midnight, wasn't something I could ignore after the metal had breathed and memorized me. That night, after the long shift where I survived the steel's attention, I found myself drawn to the observation deck again, despite every instinct screaming to stay away. The rig's platform lights flickered faintly, reflecting off the abyssal black below, and I could see nothing but an infinite void that pressed up against the glass like it was alive. My hands hovered over the railing, gloves still on, heart hammering, knowing that even a glance could change everything. I leaned forward, resisting the urge to glance into the deep trench, trying to remind myself of the rule. But the darkness seemed to pull at me, a slow, deliberate pressure that made my vision tunnel. My eyes flicked downward despite myself, catching a faint glimmer far below, something moving against the normal flow of water. It wasn't a reflection or a shadow from the platform lights. It was deliberate, slow, and purposeful, like something alive was testing whether I would watch. I cursed under my breath, feeling the weight of Rule 3, never look into the depths alone after midnight, and knew the steel beneath me remembered me. I wasn't alone for long. Malik's voice echoed behind me, calm but carrying a warning I couldn't ignore. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I tried to focus on him, not the trench, but my eyes betrayed me. The abyss seemed to stretch farther than possible, the shadows dancing at angles they shouldn't. I shivered, gripping the railing as a faint vibration ran through the metal once more, subtle, like a warning pulse. "It knows you're looking," Malik muttered, "and the moment you focus, it remembers every second of it." The movement in the water caught my attention again. At first, I thought it was a fish or drifting debris, but then the shape grew larger, more defined, and I realized with a sinking heart that nothing in the ocean moved like that naturally. It glided smoothly, silently, and seemed to match my gaze, responding to it. I froze, my chest tightening, gloves pressing into the railing. Malik's hand gripped my shoulder, firm and urgent. "Stop looking. Just don't. One glance is all it takes," he warned. Eyes fixed on the abyss, but my curiosity battled instinct, a dangerous conflict I couldn't control. The platform trembled faintly as the object descended farther, disappearing then reappearing in my peripheral vision. Each pulse of the steel beneath me echoed the rhythm of my heartbeat, as if the rig itself was reinforcing the warning of Rule 3. I realized the metal's breathing wasn't random anymore. It was synchronized with the abyss, responding to something moving in the trench below. My stomach turned as I imagined the energy transfer, something alive, ancient, using the steel and me both as conduits for its awareness. Every instinct screamed to step back, but the thrill of the unknown pinned me to the observation deck, like I was stuck in quicksand. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The object below didn't rise, didn't retreat. It simply hovered, deliberate and patient, as though waiting for me to commit a fatal mistake. I couldn't blink, couldn't look away. I tried to talk to Malik, to ground myself. What is it?" I whispered. His eyes didn't leave the black void. "Something older than this rig, older than the ocean above it," he said, his voice trembling slightly despite his usual stoicism. The shadows around the abyss seemed to stretch unnaturally, the faint light from the rig elongating them, like fingers reaching up toward us. I leaned closer to the glass, despite Malik's warning, the vibration from the steel crawling up my gloves into my wrists. My reflection merged with the darkness below, the abyss and I almost blending together, and I thought I saw movement mimic my own. A slow, deliberate ripple in the water matched my hand trembling against the railing. I recoiled in horror. It wasn't water that responded. It was something far older, far smarter, something that didn't belong in any known part of the ocean. My pulse raced as I remembered the first two rules, the tremors, the breathing metal, and now this new undeniable presence. Malik grabbed my arm again, steadying me. "You've broken it," he said quietly. "Looking alone after midnight, that's the one thing it marks permanently. It watches you differently now." I felt a cold panic settle into my chest, a realization that the abyss wasn't passive. Whatever moved down there, whatever watched us through the platform and the steel, had now taken note of me. I shivered uncontrollably, my vision drawn involuntarily to the black void. A part of me wanted to turn away, but the pull of the unknown was overwhelming. The water shimmered faintly in the distance, subtle currents bending unnaturally. Something seemed to be moving closer to the rig, slow and precise, as though it had calculated the perfect timing to align with my presence. My gloves felt inadequate, my body rigid, every nerve screaming at me to retreat. The steel hummed in response, faint but insistent, almost like it was speaking directly to the entity below. I realized the platform itself had become part of the interaction, my glance, my fear, my presence, all recorded and mirrored by the breathing metal and whatever waited in the trench. Suddenly, a shadow shot upward through the abyss, a swift fluid movement that disappeared as quickly as it came. I gasped, stumbling back from the railing. Malik placed a hand on my shoulder, firm and protective. "Did you see that?" I whispered, voice cracking. He nodded grimly, his eyes darting toward the lower deck. "It only shows itself when you break Rule 3, he said, "to let you know it's aware of you. To remind you that curiosity has a price." My heart pounded, every muscle tight, as I realized the rig and the abyss were working together in a way I couldn't begin to comprehend. The minutes stretched endlessly, silence punctuated only by the faint pulsing through the steel and my own ragged breathing. I couldn't look away again, yet I knew I had to. Malik whispered, "Close your eyes, turn around, don't look until someone else is with you. Don't look." My body obeyed reluctantly, and the relief of not seeing the abyss felt almost immediate, but the unease remained, a creeping sense that I had been permanently marked. Every shadow, every vibration, every faint tremor reminded me that the rule wasn't just guidance, it was survival. When I finally left the observation deck, the darkness of the trench still seemed to reach for me, as if my eyes had left a residue in the water itself. The steel pulsed beneath my boots, subtle, quiet, but insistent, echoing every heartbeat, every shiver. I realized Rule 3 wasn't about the abyss alone, it was about the connection between me, the rig, and whatever ancient intelligence moved below. Looking alone after midnight was a trap, a way for the trench to understand me, to mark me, to ensure that I remembered the abyss in every moment that followed. By the time I reached the lower maintenance hall, I felt the weight of my choice pressing down. Every bolt, every girder, every shadow in the corridor reminded me that Rule 3, never look into the depths alone, after midnight, was more than a guideline, it was a lifeline. The abyss had seen me, remembered me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already plotting the next interaction. The first tremor, the metal breathing, and now my eyes had all drawn its attention, and deep below, I knew it was waiting for the next mistake I was about to make. The fourth rule, Rule 4, never follow the shadows into restricted areas, became horrifyingly clear after my experience with the trench in the metal. That night, while walking along the dimly lit maintenance corridor, I noticed shadows flickering oddly along the walls, moving against the direction of the rig lights as if they had their own intent. Normally shadows bend and stretch with the light, but these didn't. They darted, paused, and lingered in corners with deliberate patience, almost as if they were guiding me somewhere. I shivered, repeating the rule to myself, but curiosity clawed at my mind, a dangerous, insistent whisper that begged me to see where the movement would lead. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion twisting reality, but every shadow along the pipes and beams seemed to respond to my presence. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, and yet the shadows moved independently, anticipating my path, pulling me deeper into sections I knew were off limits. I whispered aloud, "Rule 4, never follow the shadows into restricted areas," but the words felt hollow against the blackness that seemed to thicken around me. One shadow lingered at the edge of a hatchway, pausing and recoiling in a way that was almost teasing, almost alive, urging me to step closer. Despite every instinct screaming not to, I found myself moving toward it. The shadows shifted faster now, converging in a pattern that led down narrow maintenance ducts I had never dared enter. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I hesitated, glancing back at the deck I'd left, considering turning around, but the pull of the shadow was magnetic, hypnotic, and I realized with terror that I had already broken the rule. My gloves brushed against the railing as I descended, and I could feel the subtle pulse of the rig beneath my hands, a reminder that the steel remembered me, synchronized with the shadow's movements below. Halfway down the narrow passage, I heard a low hiss, like air escaping from somewhere deep within the platform, but it wasn't mechanical, it had rhythm, almost like it was breathing in tandem with the shadows. The walls pressed closer, the ducts narrowing, as though the rig itself were guiding me towards something waiting. I whispered to myself, repeating the rule, trying to anchor my mind. Never follow the shadows into restricted areas. Never follow them. But my voice was swallowed by the cold, stagnant air. The shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, darting just far enough to pull me forward, teasing, testing, and I felt a growing dread as I realized they knew I had ignored the warning. The corridor opened into a chamber I didn't recognize, dimly illuminated by a flickering red emergency light. The shadows coalesced into darker shapes along the walls, moving in patterns that mimicked my own movements, anticipating me. My heart hammered as I scanned the room, realizing there was nothing human here. Pipes bent at impossible angles, and the walls pulsed faintly, like a living organism waiting for my attention. I tried to retreat, but the shadows elongated toward me, stretching unnaturally, as though warning me not to leave. I gritted my teeth, repeating Rule 4 silently, trying to summon courage I didn't have. As I stepped closer, I noticed something carved into the wall, faint scratches, forming symbols that pulsed faintly, like they were alive. A cold sweat ran down my back. I touched the symbols instinctively, and the shadows shifted violently, recoiling and converging at one corner. My gloves tingled under the pulse of the metal beneath me, synchronized with the shadow's movement, and I understood that the rig was now an intermediary between the abyss below and whatever waited in the room. I wanted to run, but my feet felt frozen, the weight of unseen eyes holding me in place. As the shadows coalesced, one shadow moved differently from the rest. It slithered along the floor, elongating and twisting, its movement precise and deliberate, as if it were studying me. I whispered, "It's just a shadow," trying to convince myself, but the pulse beneath my gloves echoed my heartbeat. Exactly. A chilling reminder that the rig and whatever inhabited it had synchronized to me completely. The air grew thick, and I felt a sensation crawling up my spine, like fingertips tracing my vertebrae, though no one was there. My mind screamed to retreat, but the shadow beckoned subtly, teasing, testing, as if to see if I would break the rule further. I edged backward, but another shadow slipped across the wall, cutting me off from the path I had entered. The chamber seemed to contract, narrowing the exits, while the shadows expanded, filling the corners, pressing closer. My gloves vibrated faintly against the rail, pulsing in time with the room, reinforcing the terror of breaking Rule 4. I could feel the rig itself holding me, an unyielding presence, reminding me that I was trapped by both shadows and steel. I whispered the rule again, desperately, hoping it would anchor me, but the darkness seemed to mock me, stretching toward my mind. Then I heard it, a faint, deliberate sound that wasn't mechanical, not water, not air. It was closer now, behind the walls, whispering through the steel in cadence with the shadows. "Come closer," it seemed to say, though no lips formed words. My heart froze. The shadows trembled in response, elongating, converging, and I realized that the entire rig was alive in a way I couldn't have imagined, using the shadows as messengers. I clenched my fists around the railing, repeating the rule one last time. Rule 4, never follow the shadows into restricted areas, trying to mentally push back the pull that threatened to drag me further into the unknown. I managed to inch toward the exit, shadows recoiling slightly as I did, yet the chamber didn't feel empty. It was watching, waiting, anticipating my next step. Every bolt and girder beneath me pulsed faintly, the rig breathing like a living creature, and I understood that the shadows weren't independent. They were conduits, extensions of whatever ancient intelligence lay below the trench. I broke free of the chamber at last, stumbling into the main maintenance corridor, heart hammering, gloves slick with sweat. The shadows retreated into the corners, but lingered at the edges of my vision, refusing to disappear completely. By the time I reached the observation deck, I realized Rule 4 had left a mark on me. I wasn't just warned, I had been noticed. The shadows had seen my curiosity, my hesitation, my fear, and somewhere deep below, the trench intelligence had taken note. The rig pulsed faintly beneath my boots, almost as if laughing at my narrow escape, and I shivered, whispering again, "Never follow the shadows, never follow the shadows." I didn't know how much time had passed, but I knew the warning had been made permanent. Any future step into restricted areas would be watched more closely, more deliberately, and I feared the consequences. The fifth rule, Rule 5, never enter the submerged tunnels without a partner, had always seemed obvious, until the night curiosity and fear combined to make it irresistible. The lower decks of the rig hid a labyrinth of narrow tunnels that dipped into the water-filled sections of the structure, places most of the crew avoided. Tonight, drawn by faint movements beneath the observation deck and the lingering shadows from the previous rule, I found myself staring at the entrance alone, gloves tight on my hands, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to wait for someone, but the pull of the unknown was overwhelming. as if the abyss itself was calling me down. I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the waterlogged darkness. The tunnel was narrow, steel walls slick with condensation, reflecting the dim red emergency lights in long streaks. Somewhere below, water shifted softly, echoing faint, rhythmic pulses that matched my heartbeat. I whispered under my breath, "Rule 5, never enter the submerged tunnels alone." But the words felt like a fragile shield against the growing sense of inevitability. The shadows from earlier seemed to linger at the tunnel entrance, flickering across the walls as if waiting for me to step inside. Despite my fear, I lowered myself into the first section of the tunnel. Water lapped gently against the steel floor, and I could see faint streams of debris swirling in the current beneath. Every sound was magnified in the enclosed space, the creaks and groans of the rig echoing back at me in strange, distorted patterns. I tried to focus on breathing steadily, telling myself it was just the water, just the metal, just fatigue. But the rhythmic pulsing from below made it impossible to convince myself. Each step sent subtle ripples through the water, and the steel beneath my boots seemed to vibrate in response, echoing the rhythm of my fear. Halfway through the tunnel, I realized I couldn't see the end. The darkness was complete, thick enough to feel like a weight pressing down on me. The water beneath my feet pulsed gently, as though something was moving in tandem with the rig, waiting. I remembered the earlier tremors, the breathing metal, the shadows, and the abyssal eyes that seemed to watch me from every angle. Each element of the previous rules converged in this corridor. I whispered again, repeating Rule 5 silently. Never enter the submerged tunnels without a partner, hoping the ritual would offer protection. I knew it could not. The first strange sound came from somewhere deep in the tunnel, a slow, deliberate splash that didn't match the rhythm of the water's natural movement. I froze, straining to hear. Then another splash, followed by a faint exhalation, almost like a sigh, echoing off the walls. My pulse quickened. I tried calling for help over the radio, but only static replied. The tunnels twisted in ways that made orientation nearly impossible, the dim light reflecting oddly off the wet steel. Every step seemed to draw me closer to something unseen, something watching, calculating, waiting for me to break the rule completely. I pressed onward, heart hammering, and that's when I noticed movement in the water itself. Not ripples, not currents, but shapes gliding beneath the surface, long and sinuous, following me. I tried to rationalize, pipes shifting, equipment falling, but the motion was deliberate, too precise, too intelligent to be natural. My gloves vibrated against the steel, faint but insistent, reminding me of the metal's memory. The tunnel felt alive, echoing every heartbeat, every tremor, every breath I took. I realized that entering alone wasn't just dangerous, it had marked me, a signal to whatever lived below. I hesitated, debating whether to turn back. The shapes beneath me shifted, rising slightly toward the surface, then sinking just out of sight. I whispered again, trying to anchor myself. Rule 5, never enter the submerged tunnels alone. But the darkness seemed to pull at my voice, swallowing it before it could resonate. My reflection in the faint water shimmer looked alien, distorted by shadows that weren't mine, stretching unnaturally. Panic clawed at me, but I knew turning around too quickly might draw attention. The abyss, the rig, and the water all seemed to conspire, watching for hesitation or misstep. Then I felt it, a current brushing against my legs that hadn't been there before. Not strong, not violent, just deliberate, subtle. It moved in perfect rhythm with the steel beneath my boots, like the rig itself was guiding the water toward me. I froze, realizing the connection between the submerged tunnels, the metal, and whatever lurked below. The rig wasn't passive, it was alive, synchronized with the abyssal entity, and my trespass alone had triggered its attention. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but the darkness pressed at me, whispering, as though the tunnels themselves were sentient. I edged backward slowly, trying to retreat toward the entrance, but the water rippled unnaturally, forming faint shapes beneath the surface, shapes that mirrored my every movement. I whispered to myself, repeating Rule 5 again, never enter the submerged tunnels without a partner, trying to make it real in my mind. The shadows on the walls lengthened, stretching toward me, while a soft, deliberate hum emanated from deep within the tunnel. The pulse of the metal beneath my boots intensified, echoing the rhythm of the water and the shadows, a combined warning I could neither ignore nor fully understand. By the time I reached the entrance, gasping, I felt as if the tunnels had marked me permanently. The water rippled faintly, receding into shadows, but the sense of being observed didn't leave. The rig pulsed subtly beneath my feet, warm, deliberate, as if it remembered every moment I had spent alone inside. I shivered, whispering once more, "Never alone," knowing that the next time I dared enter, the abyss would anticipate me even faster. The entity below, the breathing steel, the shadows, they had learned me, synchronized me, and I wasn't sure I'd ever walk these tunnels without the same dread returning. The sixth rule, Rule 6, never ignore the whispers from the lower decks, became impossible to dismiss after the submerged tunnels. That night, exhausted and still trembling from my solo venture into the water-filled passages, I was walking toward the crew quarters when I first heard it, a faint, almost inaudible murmur coming from the lower decks. At first I thought it was the wind or the rig settling, but the cadence was too deliberate, too precise, like words trying to form. I froze, every muscle tense, gloves gripping the railing, and whispered to myself, Rule 6, never ignore the whispers from the lower decks, realizing that even hearing them was the first step toward danger. The sound grew slightly louder as I descended the narrow stairs, each step creaking faintly under my weight. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping, echoing faintly off the steel walls in soft, irregular patterns. I strained to make out words, but they remained elusive, teasing the edges of comprehension. My pulse matched the rhythm of the whispers, the vibration of the steel beneath my boots joining the symphony. The shadows from previous nights seemed to stretch along the walls, flickering toward the sound, as if guiding me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and whispered again, repeating the rule, never ignore the whispers from the lower decks, hoping the words would ward off the sensation of being lured deeper. The murmurs began to form shapes in my mind, snatches of voices I thought I recognized. One sounded like Malik's, calm and distant, another like my own, panicked and uncertain. I stopped, gripping the stair rail as a sudden tremor ran up my legs, synchronized with the soft, deliberate exhalations of the steel. My heart raced as I realized the whispers weren't just sounds. They were invitations, calls from the depths below and the rig itself, using the vibrations to communicate, to test my fear. The realization made my stomach twist, the weight of the abyss pressing down on me, even as I tried to remain rational. I descended further, each step drawing the whispers closer, clearer, more insistent. I tried to speak into the radio, but only static responded. The lower decks were abandoned, shadows pooling in corners, steel groaning faintly, as though the rig itself were alive. I could hear my heartbeat in every murmur, the whispers mirroring my thoughts, taunting me. I whispered the rule again, hoping to anchor my mind. Rule 6, never ignore the whispers from the lower decks. But the sound persisted, layered, almost sentient, pulling me forward, testing my resolve. A soft shuffle caught my attention, and I turned sharply, but nothing moved in the narrow corridor. Yet the whispers shifted, coalescing into a pattern, circling me like invisible hands, reaching toward the core of my consciousness. I felt as if the rig and the trench had conspired to amplify the voices, merging their presence into one terrifying entity that demanded recognition. Every bolt and girder vibrated in subtle, measured pulses, reinforcing the whisper's rhythm. My breath caught as I realized I was not merely being warned, I was being observed, measured, and judged. I pressed on, each step deliberate, the whispers threading through the metal and my mind simultaneously. I glimpsed shapes in the corners of my vision, indistinct, fluid, shifting in response to the murmurs. The steel beneath me pulsed warmer now, almost like it was drawing energy from me, and the whispers intensified, forming syllables I couldn't comprehend, yet felt meant for me alone. I whispered to myself, trying to stay grounded. Don't ignore, never ignore. But the words faltered against the relentless insistence of the lower deck voices. Reaching a junction, I noticed a faint red light flickering, highlighting the edges of the walls, reflecting off wet patches like eyes in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic cadence that seemed to anticipate my movements. I froze, realizing that even slight hesitation had a cost. The voices seemed to respond directly to my actions, changing pitch, pace, almost like a predator reacting to prey. My gloves vibrated subtly, synchronizing with the whispers, a reminder that the rig remembered me, marked me, and amplified the risk of breaking the rule completely. I edged forward into a small chamber, where the whispers became more coherent, forming broken phrases that sounded like names, dates, events, but none I recognized. The air felt heavy, each breath pulling at me, dragging my focus deeper into the chamber. I felt a presence, unseen yet immediate, pressing from the shadows, the steel, and the water beneath the platform. The whispers no longer seemed accidental, they were intentional, probing, beckoning. I could feel the weight of the rig and the trench pressing in tandem, guiding me, testing me, waiting for me to act recklessly. I backed away slowly, repeating the rule under my breath one final time. Rule 6. Never ignore the whispers from the lower decks, hoping the ritual would act as a protective anchor. Yet the murmurs continued, echoing softly down the halls even as I ascended the stairs, distant but insistent, like a lingering memory that refused to fade. The steel beneath my feet pulsed faintly, warm and deliberate, a reminder that my presence had been noted and recorded. Every instinct screamed to leave the lower decks entirely, yet I could feel a pull, subtle but undeniable, coaxing me to return. By the time I reached the main observation corridor, the whispers had faded into the distant hum of the rig, but the effect lingered. The shadows from previous nights stretched along the walls, motionless yet poised, as if awaiting my next mistake. I realized that Rule 6 wasn't simply a warning, it was a law enforced by the convergence of rig, trench, and unseen intelligence. Ignoring the whispers was survival, acknowledging them risked being drawn further into a web I couldn't yet understand. The lower decks had claimed my attention, and somewhere in the darkness, the rig and the abyss were recording every second. The 7th rule, Rule 7. Never open the emergency hatches without confirming the sensors, had always seemed like basic procedure until the night I forgot it. After the whispers from the lower decks, I was jittery, every pulse of the rig echoing through my gloves, every shadow seeming to stretch longer than physics allowed. A sudden alarm had triggered in the northern section, a subtle blinking red light accompanied by a low vibration running through the steel beams beneath my boots. Instinctively, I reached for the nearest emergency hatch, forgetting to check the digital sensor display, my mind racing with fear, curiosity, and exhaustion. As my gloved hand gripped the handle, the metal beneath it pulsed faintly, warmer and more insistent than usual, echoing my racing pulse. I hesitated, recalling the rules silently, whispering, Rule 7: never open the emergency hatches without confirming the sensors. But the urge to see what lay beyond the hatch was overpowering. I twisted the handle, and a faint hiss of pressurized air escaped. The steel around me vibrated more intensely, almost as if it disapproved of my haste. Shadows shifted at the corners of my vision, lengthening toward the hatch, as if drawn to my impatience, and a cold, creeping sensation ran up my spine. The sensor display finally flickered on, too late to prevent the mistake. The readout was erratic, pressure levels fluctuating, water intrusion detected but unquantified, and an anomalous thermal spike crawling along the edges of the platform. I froze, realizing my breach might have triggered something unforeseen. A subtle exhalation pulsed beneath my boots, synchronized with the faint hiss of the hatch, and I could feel the rig, the metal, and the abyssal intelligence all converging on my misstep. Shadows moved more deliberately now, creeping along the walls, elongated, almost sentient, reflecting the rhythm of my heartbeat, and the pulsation of the metal. Despite the warning, curiosity clawed at me. I cracked the hatch open slowly, the hinges whining faintly under pressure, revealing the submerged chamber below. The water there was unnaturally still, black as ink, reflecting the dim emergency lights in distorted, dancing patterns. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, slow and deliberate, and my pulse spiked as I realized that opening the hatch without checking the sensors had exposed me to the unknown. The vibrations of the rig intensified, a subtle but chilling reminder that the steel remembered every touch, every misstep, every broken rule. I whispered again, repeating Rule 7, never open the emergency hatches without confirming the sensors, trying to anchor my fear. But the reflection in the water shifted independently of me. Shapes beneath the surface moved in patterns that didn't belong to natural currents or mechanical interference. The water pulsed subtly, synchronized with the steel, like a heartbeat in tandem with my own. A shadow moved just beneath the hatch, long, thin, deliberate, and I realized the breach had drawn its attention. Every instinct screamed to close the hatch, but my frozen hands lingered, paralyzed by a mix of fear and fascination. A sudden sound echoed from deep within the chamber, a low, wet scraping that wasn't mechanical, not metal against metal, but organic, deliberate, testing me. I stumbled back slightly, gloves scraping against the edge of the hatch, and the vibration beneath my boots surged, echoing the rhythmic pulse of the unknown in the water below. Shadows on the walls mirrored the movement beneath the hatch, stretching unnaturally, flickering in perfect response to the shapes beneath. I realized that the rig, the abyss, and whatever inhabited the depths were now working in perfect synchronization, all focused on my error. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, whispering again, never open the hatch, never open the hatch. The words felt feeble against the presence that had already acknowledged me. The water shifted slightly, forming faint silhouettes that seemed almost human, yet impossibly long, thin, and fluid. The steel beneath my gloves pulsed warmer, vibrating in harmony with the movement in the water. My heartbeat synced unnaturally with the pulse, and I felt a creeping realization. The moment I opened the hatch without checking the sensors, I had invited something to observe me, study me, and potentially follow me. I carefully closed the hatch, the hinges protesting faintly, but the vibrations persisted, subtle yet insistent, traveling through the metal and up into my gloves. The shadows retreated slightly, but lingered at the edges of my vision, as if waiting to see my next move. I backed away, whispering the rules silently, repeating Rule 7 in my mind, like a mantra, hoping it would protect me from whatever had been disturbed by my mistake. Every step I took away from the hatch felt deliberate, cautious, as if the rig itself were testing whether I had learned the lesson. By the time I reached the central corridor, the temperature seemed to drop slightly, the vibrations softening, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. The shadowed corners, the pulsing steel, and the abyssal memory of the water below had left an imprint on my mind, a subtle reminder of my vulnerability. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just a guideline for safety, it was a mechanism to preserve sanity, to prevent the rig and the unseen intelligence beneath from exploiting my impatience. Every forgotten step, every impulsive act, left a permanent mark, a resonance that could not easily be erased. I leaned against the rail, trying to catch my breath, gloves still vibrating faintly against the steel. The reflection in the water of the closed hatch shimmered strangely, independent of any light source, as if acknowledging my retreat, yet warning me that my breach had not gone unnoticed. The rig pulsed subtly beneath my boots, the shadows shifted, elongated, and the memory of the abyss seemed to linger, a quiet, patient threat. I whispered one last time to myself, Rule 7, never open the emergency hatches without confirming the sensors, and felt a shiver of understanding settle deep in my chest. The 8th rule, Rule 8. Never trust the automated lights during a blackout, had always seemed simple, until the first real blackout hit the rig at the Mariana Trench. I was walking toward the observation deck, after checking the emergency hatch, when the main lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim glow of backup LEDs that seemed insufficient against the suffocating darkness. I felt a pulse of dread crawl up my spine as I remembered the rule, whispering to myself. Rule 8. Never trust the automated lights during a blackout, but the faint glow ahead lured me forward, deceptively comforting. The shadows that had been my constant companions now seemed to thicken, blending into the darkness, and I realized that the lights might be masking more than they revealed. I stepped cautiously, gloves brushing against the cold metal railing, every footstep echoing in the empty corridor. The backup LEDs flickered intermittently, shadows stretching in impossible angles and retreating in ways the flickering shouldn't allow. I could see the reflections in the steel walls forming shapes that shifted independently of my movement, dancing along the corridors with a subtle, deliberate intelligence. I tried to rationalize faulty LEDs, my imagination, exhaustion, but the vibrations of the rig beneath my boots synced unnervingly with the flickering lights, each pulse a quiet reminder of the presence that had been observing me since the first rule. I whispered again, repeating Rule 8. Never trust the automated lights during a blackout, hoping the words would anchor me against the creeping fear. As I advanced, the lights seemed to respond to me, flickering faster when I paused, dimming when I turned, as if testing my reactions. I realized with a jolt that the blackout wasn't random. It was synchronized with the rig's pulse, the abyss below, and the shadows that clung to the walls. My heart hammered as I realized every instinct I'd built over nights of survival was being challenged. I whispered under my breath, "Stay calm, the lights can't be trusted. Never trust the lights." But the shadows seemed to lean closer, reflecting the faint glow in shapes that shouldn't exist. The rig's metal beneath my gloves pulsed in harmony with the deceptive lights, an insistent reminder that everything here was alive in ways I didn't yet fully understand. Then I noticed a movement in the corner of my eye, an unnatural shift where the dim LEDs failed to illuminate. A shadow stretched, elongated, independent, almost liquid, moving in perfect synchronization with the blackout pulses. I froze, gloves tightening against the railing, knowing that following the flickering light could lead me directly into danger. The whispers from the lower decks drifted faintly up the hall, merging with the rig's subtle hum, a warning I couldn't ignore. My pulse matched the irregular flicker, every vibration beneath me a reminder that the lights were unreliable, a trap, a lure designed to disorient and test my resolve. I tried to retreat, but the shadows responded instantly, shifting to block my path subtly, manipulating perception. The LEDs pulsed again, creating phantom corridors where none existed, reflections of steel that bent and twisted impossibly. My gloves tingled against the railing, as if the rig were feeding my fear back to me, amplifying it. I whispered once more, repeating Rule 8, trying to assert control over the environment, but the blackout and the automated lights were cunning, masking the abyss's presence, testing whether I could discern reality from deception. Each step forward felt heavier, more deliberate, as though I were walking into a gauntlet designed to measure my fear. A sudden creak echoed from the ceiling above, subtle but precise, followed by a faint ripple along the floor. My breath caught as I realized the shadows weren't just passive, they were moving with intent, guiding me, or perhaps manipulating me towards something I couldn't yet see. I wanted to call out, to check my radio, but static met me again, a harsh reminder that the blackout had isolated me. I whispered, Rule 8, don't trust the lights. Never trust the lights, trying to ground myself, but the reflection of a dark shape lingered at the edge of my vision, unilluminated yet distinctly present. I edged forward cautiously, letting my instincts guide me, rather than the flickering LED. The steel beneath my boots pulsed faintly, synchronized with the subtle, deliberate movement of something unseen, and I realized the rig itself was part of the test. The automated lights were a tool, a probe, and I had been their subject. Shadows shifted in response to every hesitation, the blackout shaping perception, the abyss influencing the behavior of both rig and light. My gloves tingled again, every nerve screaming in tandem with the vibrations, reminding me that the darkness and the light were equally dangerous. As I reached the junction leading to the observation deck, the LEDs flickered one last time, casting distorted reflections along the walls. I could see shadows converging, elongated and fluid, stretching toward the direction I needed to go. I whispered again, repeating the rule silently, grounding myself in its truth. Rule 8. Never trust the automated lights. During a blackout, every instinct screamed to proceed cautiously, to trust nothing, to rely only on what I could discern independently. The blackout wasn't just an absence of light. It was an active presence, testing my reactions, measuring my fear, synchronizing the rig and the abyss in a silent, deliberate challenge. By the time I reached the observation deck, the normal lighting resumed slowly, blinking back into life, but the unease lingered. Shadows retreated into corners, but the memory of their independent motion remained, a quiet, persistent warning. I realized that Rule 8 wasn't merely about safety or procedure. It was about survival, about understanding that the rig, the abyss, and whatever intelligence moved within and beneath it could manipulate perception itself. Every broken assumption left a mark, and every misstep was remembered by the pulsing steel and the living darkness below. The 9th rule, Rule 9. Never respond to signals from the deep-sea antennae, had always been clear in the manuals, yet the moment came when clarity wasn't enough to restrain my curiosity. That evening, after the blackout and the rig's deceptive lights, the faint hum of the antennae rose in the lower deck corridors. It was subtle at first, almost inaudible, a vibration through the metal that seemed synchronized with my heartbeat. I froze, whispering to myself, Rule 9, never respond to signals from the deep-sea antennae. But the low, deliberate hum called to something buried deep in my instinct, like a predator teasing its prey. As I approached the antennae room, the vibration intensified, each pulse moving through the steel beneath my gloves, resonating through my chest. The shadows that had been my constant companions stretched along the walls, elongating unnaturally toward the sound. The hum formed faint patterns, irregular but deliberate, almost as though it was speaking in a language I couldn't yet comprehend. My mind raced. Could it be an actual communication, mechanical interference, or something far older? I repeated the rule aloud softly, never respond to signals from the deep-sea antennae, hoping to anchor my mind against the pull of the sound, but the vibration seemed to tug at me, insistent and precise. I touched the control panel, fingers hovering over the buttons, gloves cold and clammy, a subtle pulse of the steel beneath me, synchronized with a rhythm from the antennae, like a heartbeat in tandem with the rig. Shapes flickered at the corners of my vision, shadows twisting and stretching against the dim corridor lights. My instinct screamed to step back, to resist, but something primal urged me to investigate, to interact. I whispered again, repeating Rule 9 silently, trying to resist the compulsion. The hum grew louder, forming patterns that mimicked my own nervous breathing, and I realized the signal was no ordinary sonar. It was intelligent, responsive, and deliberate. The room seemed alive as I pressed the emergency override panel, trying to monitor the signals without activating them. The hum shifted, responding instantly to my presence, fluctuating in tone and intensity. Shadows writhed across the walls, twisting in ways the emergency lights shouldn't have allowed. My gloves tingled, the steel beneath me vibrating more strongly, echoing the signals through my body. I tried to rationalize interference, faulty wiring, but the pulsing beneath my boots, the shadows, and the hum all synchronized too perfectly, as if the rig, the antennae, and the abyss itself were conspiring. I whispered softly, repeating Rule 9, never respond to signals from the deep-sea antennae, grounding myself in the warning, yet aware I was teetering on the edge of transgression. I leaned closer to the antennae, heart hammering, as the hum fluctuated, forming subtle patterns I could almost decipher. A faint light blinked along the panels, synchronized with the vibrations in the steel, and I realized that ignoring the signal might be my only protection. Yet the curiosity to know what lay beneath, what the abyss was trying to communicate, was overwhelming. The shadows on the walls shifted subtly, reaching toward me like hands in the dark, testing whether I would break the rule completely. The metal hummed beneath me, almost like a warning pulse, reminding me that my presence had already been noted. A low, almost imperceptible vibration ran up the wall, spreading through the steel, and I realized the signal had a reach far beyond the antennae itself. It connected to the rig, the steel, and perhaps the abyss below. Shapes flickered beneath the floor plates, movement synchronized with the hum, stretching and contracting in rhythm. My breath caught as I felt a cold, deliberate presence brushing against the base of my spine. I whispered again, repeating Rule 9, trying to resist the pull, but the vibrations were growing insistent, coaxing me, challenging me, testing the limits of my obedience. I stepped back, hands trembling, gloves slick, trying to retreat to the safety of the main corridor. Yet every step I took, the hum seemed to follow, synchronizing with my heartbeat, echoing faintly through the metal, and I realized with a sinking feeling that ignoring it once was not enough. The antennae pulsed in response to my fear, shadows danced in perfect alignment with the signals, and the abyss below seemed to respond to the vibration, as if aware of my hesitation. I whispered the rule one more time, trying to mentally anchor myself, never respond to signals from the deep-sea antennae, but the pull remained, subtle, patient, and dangerous. The vibration beneath my boots shifted suddenly, becoming more deliberate, almost like a tap, a beckoning. The shadows elongated, stretching across the walls in impossible angles, independent of the flickering lights. I froze, realizing that the signal wasn't just communication. It was a lure, a test, a mark. Any response, even a glance, could tie me to whatever waited below, to the intelligence that synchronized rig, antennae, and abyss alike. My gloves tingled sharply as I took a cautious step back, whispering the rule again, trying to hold on to control while the shadows and vibrations pressed closer. By the time I reached the stairwell to ascend, the hum faded slightly, but the unease remained, vibrating through my mind and body. The shadows retreated but lingered, twisting unnaturally at the edges of my vision. I realized Rule 9 wasn't just a guideline, it was a safeguard against being marked, recorded, and drawn into something far older and more intelligent than the rig itself. The antennae were no longer passive instruments, they were conduits, extensions of the abyssal intelligence below, capable of testing, measuring, and punishing curiosity. Every vibration, every shadow, every subtle movement was a reminder of the danger that awaited if the rule was broken again. The 10th rule, Rule 10, never disturb the pressure valves without a safety override, was drilled into us during every safety briefing. Yet exhaustion and the haunting events of the previous nights made caution fragile. That evening, after navigating the darkness, the shadows, and the pulsing vibrations of the rig, I found myself at the valve control room, drawn by a subtle shift in pressure readings. The monitors flickered erratically, alarms quiet but insistent, echoing faintly through the steel corridors. I whispered under my breath, Rule 10, never disturb the pressure valves without a safety override. But the readings teased me, a puzzle I felt compelled to resolve, despite every instinct screaming otherwise. Gloves slick with sweat, I approached the main valve panel, heart hammering in synchronization with the rig's subtle pulse. The pressure gauges wavered unpredictably, hinting at a possible leak in the submerged sections below. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, flickering in time with my footsteps, as though aware of my curiosity. I glanced at the backup manual and whispered the rule again, never disturb the pressure valves without a safety override, hoping the reminder would anchor my decision-making. But the vibrations beneath my boots intensified, syncing perfectly with the erratic gauge needle, and I realized that hesitation alone might provoke a consequence as lethal as a mistake. I tried to rationalize my next steps. The valve system was crucial. A minor misalignment could cascade into catastrophic failure. Yet the pulsing steel beneath my gloves and the shifting shadows reminded me that the rig was alive in a way no manual could teach. A subtle vibration ran along the pipe network, almost like a heartbeat, and I felt its warmth against my palms as I considered overriding the safety protocols. My chest tightened, every nerve screaming a warning, and I whispered the rule again softly, trying to anchor myself in reality. The abyssal intelligence below, whatever had been observing me all this time, seemed to lean closer, waiting for a misstep. I glanced at the sensors again. They were fluctuating wildly, showing pressure spikes that shouldn't have existed. Every instinct urged caution, but the compulsion to act, to stabilize the rig, gnawed at me. As I reached for the manual override lever, the shadows at the corners of the room elongated, moving with a precision that seemed impossible. The steel beneath my gloves pulsed more insistently, almost like it remembered every previous mistake I'd made. I whispered one last time, repeating Rule 10, trying to maintain focus. Never disturb the pressure valves without a safety override. Never. The words felt insufficient against the mounting tension. With trembling fingers, I nudged the override panel, just enough to see if the system would respond without engaging it fully. Immediately, the vibration beneath me shifted, resonating through the floor, up my arms, and into my chest. The shadows responded, coalescing toward the valves in long, sinuous shapes, anticipating my every motion. The pressure reading stabilized briefly, then surged in an unnatural rhythm, like the rig itself was mocking my hesitation. I whispered under my breath, repeating the rule in a bid to reinforce caution, but the subtle pulse and looming shadows made it clear that the abyss below had noted my testing of boundaries. A sudden hiss of pressurized air erupted from the lower pipes, sending a shiver down my spine. The gauges swung violently, shadows twisting across the walls in unnatural shapes that didn't obey the flickering lights. My pulse matched the vibrations beneath my boots, a frightening resonance that reminded me the rig, the water, and the unseen presence below were connected. I swallowed hard and whispered Rule 10 again, reinforcing it in my mind. Never disturb the pressure valves without a safety override. I understood that any further action could provoke a violent reaction from the rig itself, from whatever entity had synchronized with its metal and water. I tried stepping back, retreating to reassess, but the vibrations beneath me persisted, warm and deliberate, like the rig remembered every hesitant movement. The shadows shifted subtly, brushing the edges of my peripheral vision, elongated and fluid, mimicking movements that weren't mine. I felt the unmistakable pressure of awareness, the intelligence below the rig observing, judging, and waiting for a mistake. Every instinct screamed to leave immediately, but I knew the pressure readings wouldn't correct themselves without action, yet acting recklessly could be fatal. I inched closer again, gloves brushing against the cold metal, whispering softly to reinforce the rule in my mind. The pulse beneath my boots seemed to accelerate in response, synchronized with the creaking steel and flickering shadows. A faint hum rose through the piping, almost musical in cadence, like the rig was speaking to me through vibrations alone. Every nerve in my body screamed in protest, a reminder that Rule 10 wasn't merely a safety guideline, it was a survival law, enforced not just by procedure, but by the living, breathing metal in the abyss below. By the time I reluctantly disengaged from the panel, ensuring I hadn't activated anything fully, the room felt heavier, the shadows lingered, and the vibrations receded only slightly. I realized that Rule 10 wasn't just about mechanical caution, it was a warning against arrogance, curiosity, and underestimating the intelligence that had intertwined with the rig and the trench below. Every misstep, every impulsive reaction, had been observed and catalogued. The rig pulsed faintly beneath my gloves as I backed toward the corridor, whispering the rules silently, hoping it would protect me from consequences yet unseen. The 11th and final rule, Rule 11. Never descend into the abyssal observation chamber alone, had always carried the weight of legends whispered among the crew, stories of men who ventured down and were never seen again. That night, after surviving the previous rules, I found myself at the top of the descending shaft, staring into the blackness beyond the hatch. My gloves trembled as I traced the cold steel edges, and I whispered to myself, Rule 11, never descend into the abyssal observation chamber alone, knowing full well that even mentioning it wouldn't fully shield me from what lay below. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying the faint hum of the rig's pulse, the echoes of the submerged tunnels, and the whispers from the lower decks. The hatch creaked slightly as I pushed it open, the darkness beneath swallowing the dim light from above. Shapes moved just beneath the observation platform, elongated and fluid, synchronized with the vibrations in the steel and the faint signals from the antenna. My heart raced, each beat amplified by the rig's subtle resonance, reminding me that every previous rule had prepared me for this, and yet nothing could truly prepare me. Shadows shifted along the walls and water below, teasing my mind with impossible patterns, reflections of something intelligent and deliberate. I whispered again, repeating Rule 11 softly, a desperate mantra against the pull of curiosity that had guided me here. Stepping onto the descending platform, I felt the pulse of the rig beneath my boots intensify, warmer and more insistent, synchronized with the abyss below. The steel around me seemed alive, vibrating in response to my every movement, as if recording my fear, my hesitation, and my intent. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying subtle vibrations that made the hair on my neck stand. Shapes in the water swirled slowly, deliberately, reflecting patterns that matched neither currents nor reflections, but an intelligence observing my every step. I whispered, never descend into the abyssal observation chamber alone, a reminder and a warning that this final descent was unlike anything before. Halfway down, the shadows became more defined, stretching across walls, pooling at corners, and even in the water below, forming shapes that seemed to watch and follow me. The rig pulsed beneath my gloves in subtle rhythms, synchronized with the shapes, the lights, and the water. My breath came fast, my gloves slick, yet I pressed on, compelled by a mix of fear and necessity. The whispers from the lower decks joined the ambient hum, forming patterns I could almost interpret, a language of the abyss that teased my understanding. I whispered the rule silently again. Rule 11. Never descend into the abyssal observation chamber alone, holding it close like a lifeline against the looming presence below. The platform shuddered slightly, responding to a vibration from below, and I realized that the abyssal chamber wasn't simply a room. It was an extension of the rig and the deep sea itself, alive, aware, and deliberate. The water shimmered unnaturally, long, sinuous shapes undulating beneath the surface, moving in perfect synchronization with the rig's pulse. My pulse matched theirs, a rhythm both terrifying and mesmerizing. Shadows flickered along the edges, creating illusions of depth and movement, blurring the line between reality and perception. I whispered the rule again, hoping the repetition would anchor my fear as I descended further into the inky blackness. Suddenly, a subtle vibration along the railing drew my attention, something brushing against the steel with deliberate intent. I froze, gloves gripping the railing, realizing I had crossed into territory that was no longer theoretical danger. The abyss had noticed my descent, and the rig itself seemed to pulse in recognition, amplifying my heartbeat and the shadow's movement. Shapes in the water below mirrored my hesitation, elongating and bending in ways impossible under natural physics. The whispers joined the pulse, forming faint patterns that seemed directed at me alone, probing, testing, measuring my resolve. I descended further, the platform groaning faintly under the stress, vibrations intensifying with every inch closer to the abyss. The shadows seemed to pulse almost liquid, and I could feel the cold presence of the abyss pressing against my senses. Shapes twisted beneath the water, impossibly long, synchronized with the rig's heartbeat, the antenna's signals, and the pressure valve's distant hum. I whispered again, repeating Rule 11, desperately trying to maintain the mental anchor that might keep me from being drawn into the unknown. The platform trembled slightly, warning me that the abyssal chamber wasn't passive. It was aware, alive, and waiting. As I reached the lowest point, the water beneath the chamber shimmered unnaturally, reflecting dim light from above in impossible angles. The rig pulsed steadily beneath me, synchronized with the abyss, the antenna, the tunnels, and the submerged chambers. Shadows gathered at the edges of my vision, long, fluid, and deliberate. My pulse raced, yet I could feel a rhythm beneath it, a pulse shared with the rig, the water, and whatever intelligence dwelled in the depths. I whispered softly, repeating the rule one final time. Rule 11. Never descend into the abyssal observation chamber alone, knowing that the repetition was both a warning and a plea. Then, without warning, the shapes beneath the water coalesced into a single dark mass, moving with impossible speed, synchronized perfectly with the rig's pulse. I could feel it observing, testing, and reacting to my fear. The shadows stretched toward me, brushing along the edges of the chamber, while whispers from below and above merged into a single eerie cadence that echoed through the steel. I froze, gloves gripping the railing, aware that this was the culmination of all previous rules, every lesson, every misstep leading to this final moment. The abyssal observation chamber seemed to breathe, pulsating in rhythm with my own heartbeat and the rig's subtle vibrations. I realized with a chilling certainty that this final rule was more than survival. It was recognition, a test of obedience, of fear, and of restraint. Any movement, any lapse, could provoke consequences I couldn't yet comprehend. Shadows flickered and coalesced, water pulsed beneath the platform, and whispers formed indecipherable patterns, all perfectly synchronized, reminding me that the abyss had been watching all along. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.